The classroom door was locked, the cameras were off, and no one was coming to help. In front of laughing classmates, a black teenage girl stood frozen as her own teacher crossed a line that could never be undone. Every tear, every second of silence, every stolen breath exposed a truth most people choose not to see. This wasn't just cruelty. It was power, abuse, and racism colliding in one moment. But just when it seemed like no one would stop it, the door suddenly burst open. And what happened next changed everything. What would you do if justice walked in at the exact moment evil thought it had won? Comment and tell us where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And subscribe for more powerful stories that demand to be heard. At Somerset High, Sienna Rose Sterling was known for keeping her head down and her grades up. She arrived early, left quietly, and treated every classroom like a proving ground where mistakes were not forgiven equally. Her world revolved around routine, school, home, caring for her grandmother, and studying late into the night. Excellence wasn't ambition for her, it was survival. As a black student in a town that had never truly welcomed difference, she understood that being average was never an option. Sienna lived with her grandmother, Clara Rose, in a modest home where dignity mattered more than appearances. Clara's health was fragile, and Sienna carried responsibility well beyond her years. Her father, Judge Sterling, was often away handling federal cases, his absence filled with phone calls, reminders to stay strong, and an unspoken promise that justice still mattered, even when it felt distant. Sienna believed in that promise, even on days when school tested her faith. Somerset High presented itself as orderly and proud, but beneath the banners and trophies lay a rigid hierarchy everyone understood. At the center of it stood Mrs. Gable, a history teacher whose authority went unquestioned. She controlled her classroom with precision, her standards shifting subtly depending on who stood in front of her. Sienna had learned to navigate those moments, raised eyebrows, lingering stares, harsher grading, without reacting. Silence she believed was safer. Then there were Austin and Leo. Popular, protected, and confident in ways Sienna could never afford to be, they moved through the halls like the rules bent around them. Their laughter followed her sometimes, low and deliberate, but never loud enough to be punished. Sienna focused on her work, believing that effort would shield her from attention. She believed that if she stayed composed, stayed invisible, nothing could touch her. That morning, she wore a white dress carefully pressed at home, a quiet symbol of pride and self-respect. It wasn't meant to stand out, only to remind herself of who she was. She stepped into school expecting another ordinary day, lectures, notes, passing bells. What she didn't know was that ordinary was about to vanish. The tension had already been building, unnoticed but deliberate. And by the time the classroom doors closed, Sienna's world was already moving toward a moment that would expose far more than anyone was prepared to face. The tension at Somerset High didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, settling into Sienna Rose Sterling's day like a shadow that refused to leave. From the moment she stepped into the building, eyes followed her longer than usual. Whispers moved faster. The white dress she wore, simple and carefully chosen, seemed to disturb something unspoken. It wasn't flashy, yet it drew attention in a place where standing out was never forgiven equally. In history class, Mrs. Gable's gaze lingered on Sienna with calculated precision. The lesson continued as normal, but the atmosphere felt tighter, heavier. Papers were returned, and when Sienna's work landed on her desk, the red markings were harsher than necessary. Her academic excellence, once tolerated, now seemed to provoke resentment. Mrs. Gable's authority filled the room, unchallenged and absolute, and Sienna felt the familiar pressure to remain silent. Silence had always been her armor. Around her, classmates shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided looking at her altogether. Others watched closely, waiting. Austin and Leo sat back with easy confidence, exchanging looks that carried more meaning than words. Their presence was loud even in stillness. They were protected by popularity, by reputation, by a system that rarely questioned them. Sienna felt it clearly now. Something was being set in motion. By lunchtime, the pressure followed her into the hallway. The crowded space offered no relief, only more witnesses. A sudden shove sent food spilling down the front of her dress, the bright stain impossible to ignore. Laughter broke out instantly, sharp and cruel, echoing off the walls. Phones lifted. The moment was captured before Sienna could even react. She stood frozen, heat rushing to her face, the humiliation settling deep. No teacher stepped in, no one stopped it. Austin and Leo lingered nearby, satisfied. Their amusement wasn't spontaneous, it was deliberate. Sienna gathered herself and walked away, every step heavier than the last. In the restroom, she scrubbed at the stain until her hands shook, but the damage was already done. The video spread quickly. Screens lit up across the school. Comments followed. Judgment multiplied. By the time she left the building that afternoon, her name carried a weight she had never asked for. At home, Sienna tried to hold herself together for her grandmother, Clara Rose. She hid the torn confidence behind practice calm, focusing on care and routine. But the cracks were widening. The humiliation from school clung to her, refusing to fade. That evening, a call from her father, Judge Sterling, offered brief comfort. His voice was steady, grounding, a reminder that justice still existed somewhere beyond Somerset. Before hanging up, he urged her to walk with dignity, no matter what awaited her. His words mattered more than he knew. The next morning, Sienna returned to school determined not to shrink. The white dress was clean again, pressed carefully, worn with intention. But confidence only seemed to escalate the hostility. In the corridors, murmurs followed her openly now. Austin and Leo blocked her path, their presence closing in. The crowd thickened, phones appeared again. What had once been whispers was now confrontation. She was pushed down a side hallway, away from witnesses who might intervene, though none had before. The door of an empty classroom shut behind her. The air inside felt suffocating. The power imbalance was unmistakable. When Mrs. Gable entered and locked the door, the situation shifted from bullying to something far more dangerous. Authority had joined cruelty. The room became a trap. Every boundary disappeared. Sienna's protests meant nothing in a space where the rules had been quietly suspended. When hands grabbed her arms and fabric tore, the humiliation cut deeper than the physical pain. The white dress, once a symbol of dignity, was ripped apart in seconds. Laughter echoed. Control was asserted. Sienna's world narrowed to that moment, fear, rage, and the crushing realization that no one had come to stop it. Then, just as everything seemed lost, the air changed. The heavy classroom door rattled violently. A force from the outside struck it hard enough to shake the walls. For the first time, the room went silent. The power dynamic faltered. And as the door began to give way, one truth became impossible to ignore. Whatever was about to enter that classroom was about to expose everything that had been hidden in the dark. The classroom door exploded inward with a force that silenced everything. The laughter stopped. The movement froze. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Light flooded the room as the door slammed against the wall, and in that instant, the power inside the classroom shifted completely. Judge Sterling stood in the doorway, his presence unmistakable. He wasn't just a father rushing to his child's side. He was authority, law, and accountability embodied. Behind him, law enforcement filled the hall, their arrival cutting through the chaos like a blade. The sight alone was enough to drain the color from Mrs. Gable's face. The woman who had ruled that room moments earlier now looked small, exposed, and suddenly aware of consequences. Sienna Rose Sterling stood trembling near the wall, clutching the remains of her torn dress. The humiliation still burned, but something else broke through it: relief. Her father crossed the room without hesitation, placing his jacket around her shoulders, shielding her from the eyes that had stripped her dignity away. In that gesture, the fear that had consumed her moments before gave way to something steadier. She was no longer alone. Judge Sterling rose slowly, turning toward Mrs. Gable, Austin, and Leo. His voice didn't need to be loud. It carried weight simply by existing. The room that had enabled cruelty now felt unbearably small under his gaze. What had been dismissed as discipline and silence was suddenly unmistakable for what it was: abuse protected by authority and fueled by racism. Mrs. Gable tried to speak, to explain, to soften what could not be softened. Her authority collapsed under scrutiny. The same system that had empowered her now stood ready to examine her actions under the law she had ignored. Austin and Leo backed away instinctively, their confidence evaporating as quickly as it had once appeared. Popularity meant nothing here. Privilege offered no shield. Phones that once recorded humiliation now captured accountability. The narrative flipped in real time. Sienna's pain, dismissed minutes earlier, was undeniable now. The torn dress, the locked door, the disabled cameras, all evidence of intent, not misunderstanding. The injustice was no longer hidden behind whispers or school walls. As officers stepped forward, the room filled with the sound of restraint, measured, procedural, final. Mrs. Gable's hands were cuffed. The same authority she wielded so freely was stripped away in seconds. Austin and Leo followed, their names no longer symbols of protection but of consequence. For the first time, the hierarchy of Somerset High cracked under the weight of truth. Sienna watched from her father's side, her emotions colliding, anger, grief, validation, and a fragile sense of justice beginning to take shape. The trauma didn't disappear, but it was no longer ignored. What happened to her could not be undone, but it would not be buried. As they led the perpetrators from the room, Judge Sterling looked down at his daughter, his expression a mixture of fury and pride. This moment was bigger than punishment. It was exposure. What had thrived in darkness was now forced into the light. And as the classroom emptied, one truth settled heavily in the silence left behind. This was no longer just Sienna's story. It was about a system that had been challenged, a lie that had been shattered, and a reckoning that was only just beginning. The days that followed the incident at Somerset High were heavy with silence, but it was no longer the kind that protected wrongdoing. Investigations moved quickly. The locked classroom, the disabled cameras, the witnesses who had looked away, everything was brought into the open. What had once been dismissed as a misunderstanding was now recognized for what it truly was: abuse rooted in racism and power. Sienna Rose Sterling did not return to school the same way she had left it. She carried the weight of what happened, but she also carried something new: validation. For the first time, her pain had been seen, acknowledged, and taken seriously. Her white dress, once torn and used to humiliate her, became a symbol of what she survived rather than what was taken from her. Healing did not come instantly, but dignity slowly replaced fear. Judge Sterling remained by his daughter's side, not just as a father, but as a reminder that accountability still mattered. The system that had failed Sienna was forced to confront itself. Teachers were questioned. Policies were reviewed. Conversations that had long been avoided were finally happening, even if uncomfortably. Somerset could no longer pretend ignorance. Austin and Leo faded from the spotlight that once protected them. The privilege they relied on proved fragile when faced with truth. Mrs. Gable's authority, once absolute, became a warning instead, a lesson in what happens when power goes unchecked and silence becomes complicity. For Sienna, the experience reshaped her understanding of strength. She learned that survival was not weakness, and speaking out was not defiance, it was necessity. Her story became more than a personal trauma. It became a reflection of a larger reality faced by countless Black students whose pain is often minimized until it is impossible to ignore. This wasn't just about one classroom or one school. It was about how easily injustice hides behind routine and how often racism thrives when no one interrupts it. Sienna's story forces a question we cannot avoid. How many moments like this pass unseen, unchallenged, and unanswered? Justice didn't erase what happened, but it ensured it would not be forgotten. And sometimes that is where change truly begins. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to Black Community Struggles for more powerful stories about justice, truth, and our community's fight to be seen. And don't forget to hit the like button. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most.